This is the MPE GPX WC grinder. We're going to present a video today about a few startup checks and a few frequently asked questions and maybe even some troubleshooting items for this grinder. We're going to go through a basic checklist of the grinder to make sure that once the grinder is received and set up at your facility, you have all the basic parts that the grinder would have came with. We'll start with hopper. This can come with an 8-pound, a 25-pound, or a 50-pound capacity hopper. This is currently the 8-pound hopper, stainless steel. This is a slide gate that controls the flow of coffee into the grinder. It can completely shut it off, or you could have the slide gate 100% open and you will be grinding at full speed. This is the control knob, which adjusts the coarseness of your grind. These hand knobs, there should be 3 of them, affix or tighten the front plate onto the grinder housing. One last item you'll see on here that you should have with the grinder is this little ground wire with the alligator clip that should be attached somewhere on your spout. We're going to go through a few startup checks for the grinder. So once again you have this grinder set up, you want to check a few things before you actually plug it in and fire it up. A, make sure everything's tight, hopper's tight, front plate is tight. This is your slide gate here. And once you loosen up this bolt here, you should be able to move this slide gate back and forth. So go ahead and make sure you can do that. Next, moving on to the control knob. Make sure that when you release the locking nut on the control knob, you can go the full adjustment range from numbers 1 to number 10. And you should feel the detent on every setting as you go through the range. Make sure your dechaff arm pivots and you have a weight on there so that you can adjust to determine how much dechaffing you would like to do with your coffee. And then next we're going to come around back to the back of the grinder, where we will check the motor rotation to ensure that you have the grinder wired up correctly so that it's turning the right way. The GPX is only designed to run in one direction, so this is a critical step. One of the common questions we get is, why is there coffee in the hopper, but coffee is not coming out of the GPX grinder? A few things to check when that happens, or if you see that phenomenon, is A, take a look at the slide gate. Is the slide gate in its open position? Have you slid it back at least halfway, if not all the way, so that coffee can be fed into the grinding chamber? Okay, the next thing, once you've checked your function of the slide gate, is if you're still not getting coffee coming out of the grinder, what you want to look at is, do you have the proper rotation going on the motor? To check the rotation on the GPX grinder, there will be a rotation arrow affixed to the back of the motor. This indicates the direction that the motor should be turning for proper operation. Another common question we get with our GPX grinder is that, hey, sometimes when we're grinding coffee, there's a lot of static electricity or a lot of coffee dust or coffee fines that are ejecting out of the bag, out of the container, it's just flying around. So here are a couple of things that you can check. We're going to talk about grounding of the unit here. The GPX came with a grounding wire attached to the base of the motor, and on the other end you will find an alligator clip. This clip is meant to clip onto the discharge spout of the grinder on any one of the 4 walls, depending on what you're discharging into. Or if you're discharging into a bag, there is a bolt on the back of the discharge chute where you can affix the clamp to. The next thing we want to look at beyond the spout is that the GPX is on 3 legs. You can certainly grind off the paint off one of your legs and attach a ground wire to your building at that point as well. Next, once your unit is properly grounded, what you'd want to check is that the D-shaft gate is intact and it's not damaged or missing. I'm going to walk through the steps on how to check that D-shaft gate now. First, you'd want to set your control knob to the coarsest setting. In this case, or in every case, it should be a number 1. Lock that in. Now you're ready to take off the 3 hand knobs to the front plate. So go ahead and start unscrewing those knobs. If you put a little pressure on the plate, just kind of hold it back. There is some spring pressure behind it. That'll make removing the hand knobs a little bit easier. Once the knobs are removed, the front plate comes right off. Now you are looking at the back of the rotor. The rotor just simply slides onto the shaft of the motor. So without any other hardware, we can go ahead and pull this rotor out. Sometimes the spring may come out with the rotor. If it does, no problem. You just take it, put it back on the motor shaft. If it doesn't come off with the rotor, just take a peek in there and double check that it's still on the motor shaft. After the rotor is removed, now you have open access visually to the D-shaft gate. The D-shaft gate is located right in here, right at the discharge spout. The D-shaft gate is attached to this pivot arm here, and by adjusting the weight, that is how much pressure the D-shaft gate will see. If that gate is missing, bent, or broken in any way, it will allow coffee to exit the grinder at a higher than desired speed. Another common question we get with the GPX grinder is that, how come my grind is not consistent? Or how come I can't get the particular grind I'm looking for? And the last one would be, how come the grind moves on me? Meaning, why does it coarsen up or why does it become finer as I'm grinding? So we'll go ahead and talk about a couple of those issues here. First and foremost, what we do want to check is that the front plate is securely and tightly installed against the housing. You want to look back here behind the lip and make sure there's no gap whatsoever between the front plate and the housing. Now we're going to walk through the calibration procedure for the GPX grinder. This is also known as the zero adjust procedure, which can be found in your manual. First, to calibrate your GPX, it must be on. As the GPX is running idle, with no coffee going through it, you should just hear a slight hum coming from the motor. First thing we're going to do is loosen up this locking screw on the control knob. There are 2 set screws on the control knob here that we will have to loosen up as the initial step of the calibration process. Once the set screws are loose off of the control knob, you will notice you can now turn the control knob independently of the central adjustment screw. What you want to do now is to rotate the control knob to setting number 10. With one hand, hold the control knob at setting number 10. Have a screwdriver handy, and now you can turn clockwise on this center screw until you hear the burrs touch lightly. That should be about the chirping that you hear on number 10. So what we're going to do now is we're going to leave that there, and we're going to tighten up the set screws on the control knob. With the control knob set at number 8, we will go ahead and loosen the set screws again to the control knob. And with your screwdriver, you want to make sure that the center adjustment screw does not move at this point. And just turn that control knob to number 10. Lock the set screws back in. Once you've done that, your GPX will have been calibrated to the factory standard settings. Another common question we have with the GPX grinder is, how do we replace the burrs? If my burrs are worn out, if they're broken, if something got into the grinder, we need to replace the burrs. How do we go about doing that? So the first step in burr replacement is to take the front plate off of the grinder. You'll find that it'll be easiest to remove the front plate if you just turn your control knob over to setting 1. Once you've done that, proceed to loosen the 3 hand knobs that hold the front plate on. Once the hand knobs are removed, front plate comes off. Again, backside of the rotor, just grab on to the ribs, and you can pull straight out. I'd like to make a side note. If your rotor does not come off as easily as you've just seen here, the grinder did come with 2 jack bolts, which you can proceed to thread in on these 2 holes, here and here, and that will help you pull that rotor out as you drive those bolts in. Once you remove the rotor, you will see that there is 1 burr that is affixed to the rotor and 1 burr that is on the housing. These burrs are identical, and they are held in by 4 screws. To actually remove the burr, simply back off the 4 screws. Once you have the 4 screws backed off, the burr should come right off of the housing. To replace, simply place the new burr in the housing and retighten your 4 screws to hold the burr in. You've just seen how to remove and replace the burr on the housing. It is exactly the same on the rotor. It's held in by 4 screws. Once you remove those, burr should come right off. You can put your new one on, retighten those 4 screws, and you're set. Now, if you've removed the screws to your burrs and it's still stuck to the back of the housing here, and you've tried pulling on this lip here of the burr and you still can't get it off, another trick you can employ is to have a screwdriver kind of placed on the meat of the burr, and you can use a mallet and just wrap lightly on the screwdriver to coerce the burr to come off. It'll start turning a little bit, and then as soon as you move it slightly, it should break loose of all the coffee dust and oils, and you should be able to just remove the burr as usual. Another common question we have with the GPX is how to clean it, how to disassemble it, how to reassemble it. So we're going to go through those steps today here, kind of in detail, take it apart, show you the internals, That way we can talk about different cleaning options for the GPX, what to do and what not to do as well. First, you are going to want to make sure before you take anything apart that the power source is off on the GPX. So the best way to do this is to simply just unplug it from the power source. It's very important, safety first. Once that's done, you can go ahead and again, turn the control knob over to number 1. We'll go ahead and remove all the 3 thumb knobs that hold the front plate on. Knobs are removed, front plate comes off. This is the back of the rotor that is now exposed. It should turn freely, it should spin freely. If you've been running a lot of coffee, you might notice there will be coffee dust buildup in between these ribs, which is okay. If you have some compressed air available at your plant, certainly take it and just blow it off. If you don't, no big deal. You could pull the rotor out and you could hand wipe the entire rotor down. It is very important that however you clean your GPX, it is a dry cleaning process. You absolutely do not want to soak or splash or hose your GPX down in any way. It is not designed for a wet wash cleaning procedure. It is a dry clean procedure only. Now that you have the GPX taken apart, you've tried to clean the rotor, you've cleaned the interior of the housing, the burrs. You want to make sure the shaft is clean as well. You could use a towel or a rag to go in there and just make sure there's no buildup around the shaft. There's also a spring that's on the shaft that you want to make sure is clean as well. So just make sure everything is floating in there and it doesn't bind up at any point. When you go back to replace the rotor, slide the rotor back on, line up the keyway, and it should slide right on. A quick test I always like to do to make sure that, to ensure that the GPX will be operating properly after we put it together, is a quick spring test on the rotor. That's how free it should spring back and forth. Now we will proceed to put the front plate back on. Okay, front plate is back on. You want to make sure all your hand knobs are tight. Make sure, again, there is no gap behind this lip here. There's no gap between the front plate and the grinder housing.